Well, hello and welcome back to the studio. Now, I'd like to introduce our panellists, and joining us today to my immediate left, Miranda Carr, Executive Director of ESG Research at MSCI. Miranda, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
And virtually, we have Chris Humphrey, who is Executive Director of the EU-ASEAN Business Council. Hello, Chris.
Hi, good afternoon.
Okay. And we also have Rochelle Mahabir, who is Head of Clean Tech and Sustainable Trade Finance at Standard Chartered. Hello, Rochelle.
Hi, Andrew.
Okay, we're having a little bit of trouble hearing people live, but hopefully that will be resolved. And finally, we then have Ila Creevy, Director and Head of Capital Markets at European Investment Bank. Ila, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you and good morning.
Okay, very good. We got some sounds there. Okay, just before we get underway, we've got about an hour for this discussion. There's a range of topics that I think have already come up in the discussions earlier today around frameworks and standards and reporting and Europe and Southeast Asia that we can dig into in some more detail. But I'm first going to ask my panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their relationship with the theme of this topic. And Chris, maybe if I could start with you from the EU-ASEAN Business Council.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, and good afternoon, everybody. So the Business Council, for those you don't know, is a membership body that represents the interests of European industry right across Southeast Asia, advocating for improvements in the trade and investment environment. And I think these days sustainability is absolutely intertwined with trade and investment, and will be even more so going forward. So for us and our members, working on sustainability issues, working on issues such as standards and reporting in that space, working on improving the financial regimes around sustainability as well is absolutely crucial going forward. And I see across the region here a vast array of approaches. Some take it more seriously than others, and of course then you have the EU, which is where all our members are headquartered, or in general wider Europe, having to look over their shoulders at a whole range of other issues coming out from the European Commission and other regulators.
So we'll come back to you in a second, but thank you very much for that initial overview. And Ila, if I could come to you from the European Investment Bank.
Yes, thank you and good morning and good afternoon wherever you are. And thank you for the invitation. So my name is Ila Creevy. I'm the Head of Capital Markets at the European Investment Bank, which is the EU's sort of investment financing arm. Why I'm here, I'm not an expert in corporate reporting or in trade. My background is purely in the financial markets, but financial markets has been moving quite quickly or quite fast in this area of sustainability in the recent years. So I've been involved in all the major European efforts on sustainable finance, starting from the high-level expert group, then the technical expert group who was working on proposals for the European taxonomy and the Green Bond Standard, and then now I'm a member of the platform for sustainable finance, which is working on the same theme, taking them forward. So this is the angle that I am here for, the financial market angle.
Thank you very much, Ila, and we're very much grateful for you joining us from Europe to share that perspective. Staying in Europe, we also have Rochelle. Rochelle, maybe if you could just very briefly introduce yourself and your role.
So thank you. I look after, like you mentioned, clean tech and sustainable trade finance. So previously, I was actually the head of sustainable finance for Standard Chartered Bank in ASEAN. The bank's ambition is to integrate sustainability in everything we do. And my very sort of biased opinion is that where we have the most positive potential impact is going to be in our trade finance business. So that was predicated a big reason of why I sort of started focusing on trade finance, because it's a massive new area of development from a sustainability perspective, but also huge potential in terms of positive impact. And I really like to talk a little bit more about that. Especially given what I did my experience most recently in Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much, Rochelle. And then finally, Miranda, who joins me here in the studio. Thank you very much. Please, very briefly introduce yourself.
Hi there. I'm Miranda Carr. I'm head of the APAC ESG research. Recently arrived in Singapore. because MSCI is one of the biggest providers of ESG ratings and also climate data and sort of climate solutions for the financial markets and also the corporate markets worldwide. But we are seeing one of the most exciting place to be, I think, for sustainability and ESG and climate issues is in Asia, and also the sheer number of developments that we're seeing in Southeast Asia mean that we've got an expanding presence here. We've just hugely expanded our team in Singapore. We're also expanding it across the region, and we're part of that sort of growing band of both adoption and awareness, I think, which is a hugely exciting part of why we're here.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, I think you'll agree that we have an excellent panel from various perspectives to dive into this issue today. I'm going to kick us off with, I think, a very simple question, but let's see where it goes. We're talking about harmonisation of standards and reporting across the region. Between the European Union and Southeast Asia. But actually, where are we on that journey? Ela, if I could come to you, I think we'd all agree that the European Union is probably most advanced on this journey towards creating common standards and so on. But maybe if I could just ask you for the sort of state of play from the European perspective around standards of reporting.
Yes, well, there's quite a lot going on, I think, in Europe and elsewhere as well. And I have not been involved in all of these initiatives, of course, because there are quite a few. I mean, we have already regulation for corporates about their procurement rules in terms of environment and human rights. Now we have the EFRAG, which is, sorry, this is a terrible alphabet soup, but EFRAG is the European Financial sort of Reporting Body, which is working on sustainability disclosures, and that should also be tying into the regulation that is ongoing to renew the large corporate and large bank reporting framework. So that is sort of one side. At the same time, there is the IFRS Foundation, who established the ISSB, another abbreviation, International Sustainability Standards Board, I believe it stands for. Which is then meant to do something similar in sustainable disclosures internationally than the IFRS has done in accounting. And of course, there should be cooperation between these two. Then we have the something which is called International Platform for Sustainable Finance, IPSF, among friends, which is then a platform for government-level cooperation in terms of taxonomies and also in terms of disclosures. They are more like mapping and comparing, not trying to establish standards, but they are comparing and seeing what is being done in different parts of the world. And there are several Asian countries who are members of that platform as well, which is, I think, that is good. I don't think we need to have sort of global standard that's a tall order to have immediately, but to be aware of what is done in different parts of the world, and at least to have the smallest common denominators when possible. But there is quite a lot going on, but not only in Europe. Europeans are trying to cooperate with other parts of the world as well. So, okay, that's the starter.
Okay. Thank you very much. And Chris, maybe I could come to you as well. You're on the ground here in Southeast Asia. You're interacting with European and Southeast Asian businesses on a regular basis. We've just heard what the sort of state of play is in Europe, but how would you describe it here within the region?
A long way behind the curve if you were comparing it to Europe. I think it's probably the fair assumption to make. And a long way away from having at least a unified ASEAN approach on this topic as well. They only just last November came out with an ASEAN taxonomy for sustainable finance, for instance, and they made it very clear it was a first draft, it wasn't the final document, and it's really out there for further development. You see individual countries coming up with their own standards and approaches for reporting for businesses. I think on the main part, Southeast Asian businesses are a bit behind the curve when it comes to the European counterparts, because the regulations in the region aren't nearly as vast as they are in Europe, and they're not facing the same sorts of pressures that European firms are from investors and from their consumers as well.
Thank you. And Miranda, to come to you then, you were just informing us that the office here is expanding. It's a very exciting place to be. Is this part of the reason? Because there's a lot of work to be done, and you're part of that?
Well, yes, and I take a slightly more optimistic stance on where the regulation's heading. Because if you think of, you basically have three different elements to the regulation. So you've had corporate governance standards, which have been a sort of key part of the regulation sort of, over the past few years. Most countries have, some level of corporate governance codes, and that's been enforced at a sort of public market level and adopted by some private markets. But the two interesting things you're seeing now is on the sort of the ESG side and then on the green taxonomy side. So on the ESG side, which is covering the environmental, social and governance issues, and so for the purposes of the supply chain, it's particularly focused on supply chain labour management issues. You're seeing the stock exchanges, you've seen Singapore has adopted new ESG reporting standards. You've got Thailand, which is going to be introducing new standards this year. And across the region, you're seeing consultations launched almost on a monthly basis to try to get the ESG standards and the ESG reporting up for the public markets, which is really important. But then the second bit, which is where you're seeing a lot of more activity, is then on the taxonomy side. And so, yes, we've got the ASEAN taxonomy that was launched last year, but we also have the Singapore taxonomy. You've already got a Malaysian taxonomy. Then just over the past couple of weeks, Indonesia and Philippines also said Philippines is a sustainable finance framework and Indonesia is a new taxonomy. And so the question is, for ESG standards, they're being introduced, they're being implemented in the region, and whether they follow the European standards or whether it's the new international standards which are being developed, which is under sort of more of the SASB principles, or looking at double materiality, which is the GRI principles, that's going to be a key momentum as we come into the region over the next few years. And then also the taxonomy, because obviously while we're forming all these taxonomies in the region, it's how much they match back to the European taxonomy. Do they follow the same principles, the same transitions, the same thresholds, same regulations? There's a huge amount of work to be done on that. But the fact it's being started and there is a lot of momentum behind that, I think is a really positive sign for the region.
Thank you. And Rochelle, maybe I could just get your input on that as well. You were based here in the region. You've recently relocated to, I believe, London. So you've got an opportunity to give a perspective from both regions.
Yeah, so I think firstly from a Southeast Asia perspective, like Miranda had mentioned, tremendous work is being done to improve disclosure. It is the right starting block. Either it's being mandated in different countries right now, or it's being sort of implemented through white papers or being just sort of discussed and paneled. With better disclosure, I think we're getting a better picture of the actual environmental and sort of social impact within Southeast Asia. While the sort of European standard, I think when it comes to sustainability and sustainable finance, is always going to be seen as the sort of gold standard. The European market started probably years ahead of what Southeast Asia had started in terms of the focus and in terms of mandating this. But Southeast Asia, my very again biased opinion, is actually moving at an exceptionally accelerated pace. So like we said, we saw the sort of initial work come out on the ASEAN taxonomy very recently. We're seeing regulators in Malaysia, Singapore, etc., talk about climate stress testing, climate risk management within the financial system. And this is all happening at exceptionally real time within the region. And they're doing it, I think, keeping pace with Europe, but also to ensure business continuity. A company operating, a multinational operating in Europe with a sort of supply chain, very, very much dependent in Asia, we can't see huge different sort of operating practices, standards, and models. So I do think that there's going to be some form of consistency that's going to come in over the next few years. Definitely, we're seeing as these sort of taxonomies get developed, they are referencing the European standard. It does obviously have to have a local context overlay into it, but I can't see huge elements of the standards law that are going to contravene each other, because your business wouldn't be able to function. And certainly it's not going to help with sustainable investing.
So let me bring the focus a little bit more on the business case here and the challenges of, let's say, tier 2, 3 SMEs within Southeast Asia. The previous channel was looking at how best to support SMEs on their journey towards ESG, better ESG standards and so on. To what extent can we be working towards European standards here in Southeast Asia? So we have some of the advanced economies of the world, and we have some of the economies on different stages of that economic development story. What I'm wondering is, where the rubber hits the ground is where we have European headquartered companies coming into Asia and working with SMEs within the region, based in countries at very different stages of development. How can we square that circle? How can we get those local firms working towards a higher standard? Or indeed, is that too much to be asking?
Well, it's really interesting with the local firms, because you're seeing, obviously, some local firms are supplying directly into Europe. So they're under huge pressure to meet the European standards already. And so if you think of a company like Thai Union, which is supplying, foodstuffs, which is a highly regulated market, directly into the European market, they're under a lot of pressure, obviously, to meet the highest standards. And that then feeds through all of their entire business line. But you're seeing, obviously, a very different, for the supply chain, then it's obviously a very different pressure. The pressure is coming from the EU companies to make sure that the supply chain is compliant. And the previous panels, talked through all of the challenges on that in terms of, how can you digitize it? How do you trace it? How do you get the SMEs to actually start? And that is one of the huge issues, because it's the data and the compliance where it is costly, it is an imposition on the companies. And so whether it's the European companies that are going to have to then persuade, either monetarily or through stopping purchasing, to get the suppliers to abide by those regulations.
And Chris, again, if I could come to you on that, given your role here within the region, what are some of the concerns, challenges, issues that you hear from your members at the EU-ASEAN Business Council?
It's a bit like what Miranda was just saying. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with a large ASEAN company or an SME in the region. As a European business, you're trading with them now, and the goods or services are going back to Europe. You have to comply, and your whole supply chain has to comply with regulations coming out from Europe. And so I think some of the biggest challenges are supporting people throughout your supply chain, down to the furthest part of that supply chain, indeed, when it comes to things like auditing for labour rights these days, and working with them all and helping them and giving them a helping hand. Because the alternative is you walk away from them and you start sourcing your goods from elsewhere. I think my biggest concern in ASEAN at the moment is a lack of realization that these regulations are out there, and it's going to impact on them, even if they're not trading direct with Europe. And I think there's a large education exercise to be done, which hopefully we are trying to do with ASEAN governments at least. And there is also a need for practical support coming from Europe, whether it's from the EU or from European businesses.
Thank you very much. I'm going to draw the attention of our audience towards our first poll. Question number 1 is, who is driving the harmonisation of standards between Europe and Southeast Asia? The consumer, regulators, financial institutions, private investors, or NGOs. And so that's the first poll that we have in this panel this afternoon. So please do have a look at that, and we'll come back to that question a little bit later on. Just sticking with the points that you just raised there, Chris, around education and practical support. Rochelle, maybe your role at Standard Chartered, when we're talking about practical support, what does that look like when we're helping firms here within the region, or European firms working with firms here in the region, to be compliant or working towards those types of standards that we need to see coming from the European Union? Rochelle, that was to you if you're still
I think,
there.
two broad pillars of that. I think the first, can you hear me now?
I can. Sorry, there's a little bit of a lag.
Two broad sort of pillars to that answer, I think. So two broad pillars to that question. I think the first most important piece that we're bringing to the equation is financing. So we're trying to tie in preferential financing to suppliers that are improving their ESG standards according to what the sort of MNCs are dictating in terms of procurement. So if, for example, an MNC has procurement guidelines that specifically to better environmental social performances, that can now be very easily tied into a financing structure. So people that are performing better, they're getting some sort of incentive. So, and I think that is where I think hopefully banking is going to sort of move consistently, especially when it comes to supply chain financing in the future. The second piece, I think, which is a difficult piece, and you mentioned tier 2 and tier 3. We're definitely seeing good adoption in tier 1, where they have a direct relationship with a large multinational, especially out of Europe. We're seeing those customers or those suppliers being surveyed. We're sort of education happening at that. So the next sort of tier 2 and tier 3 is a work has to go into in terms of either developing bespoke solutions, finding better ways, like the previous one talked about, in terms of measuring data, getting that education out there. And I think that's what sort of needs to happen now. It needs to be both cooperation between industry, between finance, between regulators on that tier 2 and 3 level, because to be honest, that's the focus that I think everybody are looking at right now. And how do you actually measure the impact? Especially on the environment, seeing that potentially there's, I think, a lot more impact on environment consequences coming from that level. So it's at very early stages. I don't think Southeast Asia is necessarily from any other sort of region in the world when you look down into that area. But right there, we have to have a lot more sort of bespoke solutions that probably doesn't even exist today.
Okay, Rochelle, thank you very much. The connection was a little bit strained, but we did hear you, so thank you very much for that. And Miranda, maybe if I could come to you on this point of educating the audience, of making sure that standards and reporting standards are understood by the business community. What role do you see for Europe in that? Or what initiatives are there in terms of educating people about the standards that Europe has? Miranda, I don't know.
No, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Ela, that was to you. Sorry, representing the European Investment Bank. Apologies.
Sorry, because I thought you were also targeting the other panelists, but this was about how can one educate?
Yes, exactly.
Basically.
Yes.
Well, that is a big question, but I think one has to sort of also separate a bit the two, that what is something a very complex reporting format and reporting rules, and then what is the need for the most important and basic information. And I think there are two angles in for example, if we think about for example, from the angle of supply chain, it's the human rights side, labor rights, but that all goes under the same headline. Let's say so, and then the environmental stuff. And I think there's we just need to see that this is something that needs to happen. It will happen. It's a transformation of the whole global trading system. We have had it's a disruption, I guess. We have had disruptions before. Big ones 100 years ago, 200 years ago, when it was very difficult for certain businesses when slavery was abolished in the US, or when child labor was forbidden, and that transition had to happen as well. This is maybe not quite as big in terms of the human suffering for individuals, but this is a big global thing. So it needs to happen, and everybody needs to be involved. At the same time, we talked a lot about the smaller companies. They do not have lots of resources to do very complex reporting and digging up a lot of information and proving that this is correct. At the same time, they have certain advantages. They operate usually in one place, one country. They operate in one business area. They are not conglomerates with 20 different businesses. So at least they can focus on what they do and where they are. So let's not forget that there are certain advantages. I don't have a real just direct answer to your question, how can one educate, but this is really a process. But I think the governmental cooperation is very important, because if only one region or one country is doing it, then it's not very helpful. Everybody needs to be on board. And while we don't need to agree on every single threshold or criteria, I think it would be extremely helpful if we had similar kind of architecture in these requirements, and if it is reporting or requirement, so that people know what we are talking about, that we don't need to reinvent the wheel in every single country. And let's take one example, which I think is gradually gaining ground. The idea in the EU taxonomy, for example, which I personally thought was answering so many questions I have heard over the years in this do no significant harm principle, i.e. it's not enough for me, for example, that I have a solar farm here which is producing clean energy. I also need to see that, I'm not destroying biodiversity where I plant my panels, that my solar panels are not unrecyclable or do not contain toxic materials, so that the whole chain of events needs to be sort of sustainable. And at the same time, I cannot be sustainable if my solar panels are fabricated with child labor. So the package of putting together that, yes, you do have to be sort of, if you call yourself, for example, green, you need to be having a good impact environmentally, but at the same time, you can't harm other areas of the environment. And you also have to be aligned with the social standards, minimum social safeguards. So I think this principle, to me, is one of the most important things here, and one of the most important inventions, that it's not enough to be one thing. You have to have the whole package together. And I think even getting that message through without details, without complicated frameworks for reporting, I think that is one of the main messages, which should not be too difficult to sort of get through at the SME level and consumer level.
Well, let me just pose that question, how well that is understood then to Miranda, and also to Chris here, being here on the ground.
Well, yes, I mean, it really is interesting how the EU regulations are feeding through. And it's interesting because, I mean, at one point it's about whether the local governments in the region then adopt similar principles to the EU taxonomy and try to align. And there's huge debate, because obviously that's imposing quite significant costs, and on industries which don't have that huge margin to play with. And so the debate about sort of how the regulations can be aligned and the cost of those regulations is a crucial one. But I think the role of how this transmits both in terms of the companies and the financial institutions is possibly less understood, because this is particularly the case. It has been the case with labour standards and some of the human rights standards, but it's becoming much more significant on climate, because now in order to get financing, the EU companies are going to, they already report their Scope 1 and Scope 2. So that's basically, from either their own, the emissions that they emit themselves, basically. But now they're under pressure for Scope 3. And so as soon as you start including Scope 3, it's all of your supply chain plus the emissions, which are, the downstream Scope 3, which we don't need to worry about for this discussion. But once you start including the Scope 3, the supply chain, that puts a huge amount of pressure on the European companies to then get their supply chain in order, because you have to know your carbon emissions and your energy efficiency, and basically your whole carbon emissions right up the supply chain. And that means you've got to have visibility, you've got to have transparency, and also you've got to get all these companies to then report on these things which they may not report at all. So suddenly, a company that was thinking, okay, I've signed up to the sort of RSPO, or I've signed up to sort of some sort of labour management organisation, but now they're going to have to start reporting all of their carbon emissions, and that's been driven by EU companies, which are going to have to start reporting their Scope 3, and it's going to impact a lot of companies throughout the region, and that's where that's been driven by both the regulation, the EU regulation, but it's also been driven by financing. So the financial institutions saying, I need to get my portfolio to net zero, and the net zero is going to include scope 3. And so the financial institutions will then not fund companies which are then not reporting on all of their emissions. So the pressures are coming from both regulatory and financial aspects, and a lot of, yes, the sort of EU. So it's not like people have much room to escape from this anymore.
Thank you. Yeah, please go ahead.
I think it's still important that we separate what is the substance in it and what is the reporting side. Reporting is one thing. It can be made hopefully simple and workable, which is not always the case, I admit. But the other thing is the substance. Yes, we want to consume and buy goods or services which have been produced in a sustainable manner, both from the human rights, labor rights perspective, from environmental perspective, from social perspective. So this is the end goal, and we should not be forgetting that end goal when we talk about the reporting. Reporting to me is like this is just a tool, and yes, tools should be made as easy as possible. I think everybody can carry on that, but it is only a tool. The actual substance is to try to live and consume in a sustainable manner.
Chris, if I could just sort of come to you on this. When you interact with European companies here operating on the ground, what's the general attitude that you come across, that it's a cost to the business, it's something that's we have to comply with because we're a European headquartered firm, or on the contrary, this is something that we really want to do, it's central to who we are as an organisation, and we want to work closely with our suppliers to help them on that journey as well? What's the sort of balance there?
The balance very much is this is something we want to do and we need to do. Not need to do because regulators in Europe are telling us to do it. It's something we need to do for the sake of our futures, for the sake of our business, for the sake of the climate, for the sake of our workers and the communities in which we're working in as well. I would just say I actually agree 100% with Miranda and Ida were just saying, but I think when it comes to the different sets of standards and approaches that are being adopted, the real key for businesses, doesn't matter whether you're big or small, is going to be interoperability and interchangeability. I think Rochelle early on in the discussion used the word consistency, and businesses want a consistent approach. They don't want to be facing a whole raft of different rules and regulations. Just makes life more complicated for them. And I think today as well, when you're a large European firm, and as Miranda has said, you've got to go right down to your furthest supplier in your supply chain and start doing audits and getting reports from them. And if they're having to do it multiple times over for different firms that they're working with in different jurisdictions, they really want to be having one set of rules to play along by, or at least one set of reporting standards to be doing, and they should be as simple as possible. And one other point, if you don't mind me just picking up on what Miranda was saying about financing, and finance houses these days looking to invest in things that are going to be net carbon zero. I was in Cambodia last week, and the clear message from the government officials, the ministers I was talking to, was please don't force us immediately to carbon zero. We know we've got to get there, but we need help to get there, and there are stepping stones along the way for us. And I think this is where one area where the ASEAN taxonomy at least is looking at it and saying, yes, we need to finance the road to get to carbon net zero. And we mustn't forget that when we're talking about these sorts of issues.
Yeah, very important point. This whole sort of time frame around transitions, and can we go straight in at the gold standard now, or how long is that going to take, and what's needed to support us to get there? I'm just going to bring us back to the first poll question, just to remind everybody who is driving the harmonisation of standards between Europe and Southeast Asia. And the poll there saying 58% regulators, 22% financial institutions, 8% each for the consumer and NGOs, and just 3% there for private investors. Does that sound right to you, Miranda?
Well, personally, I mean, maybe because I'm slightly biased because of our client base, I would say the financial institutions are a key part of that, because yes, the regulators are pushing this because they, yes, want to get to ensure sustainability across the region and you know, in Europe as well. So yes, you have the regulatory drive, but a lot of it is coming from the financial institutions. And you know, if you talk to some of the companies in the region, particularly on some of the climate issues, they're really worried about not being able to get financing anymore, because either because on the fixed income side or the debt side, the financial institutions are saying no, we we are potentially limiting our exposure to coal or any other sort of fossil fuels or sort of carbon intensive industries. And so you've got this. I mean, I've heard sort of real fear in the voice of some of the sort of companies where they're going, if we don't do this, we're not going to be able to be financed. And that pressure is coming from the asset owners, is coming from the asset managers, and obviously that's also coming from their client base. So in some ways, it's the financial investors, whether it's pension funds or insurance companies, where, so it flips back to the consumers saying, actually, we want these standards in our financial markets as well. So yes, I understand the regulatory answer, but I think don't underestimate, particularly for things like trade financing, which was brought up in the previous panel, how important that can be and what changes that can really make. Because if people can't get financing, then they go out of business.
Yeah, indeed. Eli, maybe I could just come back to you. So we're picking up there on financing in its relation to fossil fuels and so on. There's maybe a bit of a sense that there's an over-focus. We're heavyweight when it comes to the sort of regulatory regime on climate-related issues. And there's a whole range of others that we've already discussed around labour, deforestation, access to clean water, and so on. Is that a fair criticism, do you think? Or do you think that where we are in Europe, it is very balanced and well-weighted across that whole broad spectrum of ESG?
Yes. Well, I think that there is quite or has been quite a heavy focus on climate for several reasons. First of all, climate is something which is globally pretty similar. If you emit 1 kilo of carbon in Vietnam or Paraguay or in Italy, it's the same carbon emission. It's very measurable and sort of equal around the world. When you start to talk about biodiversity or water problems, pollution, we have very, very different scale of problems and very different measurements. It can be in some places of the world we have too much water, in some places we have too little water. So clearly the measurements can't be the same. That is one reason we just don't have as quite a good yardstick as we have on carbon emissions. The other thing is that this famous taxonomy that has become a worldwide phenomenon it started with climate because of the same reason also that climate was sort of the lowest hanging fruit in all of this, the scope of the work that was set. And now, for example, this group that EU has set together is working on all those other, on water, on pollution, on biodiversity, on all of those criteria. And it's a hard work as well. We'll see when that comes out. I've seen that biodiversity since approximately a year has been much more on the forefront. I think there were some big events a year ago and there were governments who were talking much more loudly about biodiversity. There's this initiative of Great Green Wall in Africa and so on and so forth. And I think all the others, they are just coming. A circular economy is getting sort of more limelight. And at the same time with the pandemic, everything to do with the social side has made a big step forward, that we need to think about the social side as well, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, which has become difficult with the pandemic, whether it's about workers' rights when companies lose business almost overnight and all of that. So I think the other areas, be it other environmental or social, they have been pushing forward while climate is still obviously there because it's maybe considered as very urgent and it's considered something which can be operated on more easily internationally. The thing about what I wanted to add to the previous speaker was that I think because this taxonomy started from climate and because it started defining what is sort of the greenest of the green when you do activities which are meant to be making a substantial contribution to climate change, to the fight against climate change. It doesn't mean that every business has to be there, or it doesn't mean that every business has to be there today. This is just defining what is the best of the best. And I think everybody agrees, also the people who have been working on this taxonomy, that not everything needs to be green. We do also need a transition in every part of the world, including Europe. Europe is no exception to that. I think I've been talking a lot about this with banks recently, and asking what are they going to do with their green business versus their fossil fuel business, and so-called brown, colloquially. And most of them, I don't think anybody has said that they quit everything fossil. Some have quit coal, for example, new coal mine financing, but almost all of them said that we want to accompany our clients and help them with the transition, and we will finance that transition. And I think that is really the word. So I don't think anybody is required to be the greenest of the green today unless they market themselves as such. Then you have to be. But if you do not label yourself that I'm the best in class and best in terms of green, what you need to have is a plan how to do this by 2050. You don't need to be there today, but you should have a plan how to get there by 2050. And this is very, very widely misunderstood. Even here, where I'm sitting in the middle of Europe, this is misunderstood that, oh, but we can't get any financing unless we are green. No, you can, and you should. But this is just to say that if you sell yourself as I'm very green, this is what you have to be. If you don't sell yourself like that, then you don't need to be that. But everybody should have this transition plan. How do I get there over 30 years? So it's not tomorrow yet.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on something, Rochelle, if I could come to you. There's a question that's come through, but just to pick up on something, that you just said, that, a kilo of carbon is the same whether it's in Cambodia or in Italy, and therefore, climate change is one of the areas where we do have some standardisation, and it's easier for us to move forward there, whereas biodiversity and so on is a little bit more different. So the question that we have here is, let me just read it out. What means green in one country might mean different things in other countries. This will then affect the meaning of requirements for green financing. Do you see one standardised reporting and taxonomy being adopted? And Rochelle, maybe if I could come to you for that question.
So it's a really good question, but I guess my sort of challenge to that is actually the definition of what is green today is actually something that's relatively well understood. So, while we have the taxonomy structures being built up in different regions, there's a network of second-party opinion providers that give the market guidance on the definition of what is green. Where the development is happening today, and it was pointed out by Ian, is on transition. So what is actually considered transition? So what is credible? How do you actually sort of measure somebody, and how do you sort of articulate and build that story? Is where the sort of massive amount of development is happening today, and that's where I think the regional lens has to be applied, because very honestly, it's really easy for a manufacturer, for example, in Europe, to decarbonize. The grid is, increasingly dependent on renewable energy. That same small-scale manufacturer does not have the same levels in Bangladesh or some other part of Asia. Their scale, the impact of which that specific company can have, is very different, and the scale of which a specific country can replace fossil fuels, for example, with renewable energy depends on the geography, it depends on the topography, and the technology available today. So that's where the art is coming into the sort of discussion, and that's where I think sort of science-driven answers are needed, sort of science-driven analysis is needed to be able to guide the industry, both in terms of or investing into working with companies that are doing things that are actually credible. So I hope I sort of got that for you.
Okay, thank you very much. Miranda, I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, meanings being different in different regions.
Oh yeah, no, I just completely agree. I mean, it's very much, all the taxonomy discussions are about sort of what thresholds you can put in on the transitions, because you don't want to have them so strict that, it's almost impossible for everyone to meet. And so therefore, particularly if it's not mandatory, a lot of the taxonomies are not mandatory. So it then just becomes a sort of gold standard that no one even bothers to try. You have to have a sort of incentive to try to try to meet it. But yes, the transition pathways for each country and for each company are so different and very complex, and that's where so much of the disagreement is coming in. But yes, hopefully we'll get some if we can align the general principles and then argue about the thresholds and the transition pathways, then that's probably quite a good starting point, I think, as for harmonization.
Okay, thank you very much. Ila, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, and that what is being discussed. There's just one angle which I had to add to that in 2015, a large number of countries agreed in Paris that we want to be sort of net zero carbon societies by 2050, and to limit the increase in temperature to 1.5 degrees. So if that is the target, then one cannot be in 75 different pathways, because if we say that we have 30 years to do this and we want to be at plus 1.5 degrees by 2050, then if you want to do a slower transition, then either you give up the 2050 or you give up the 1.5 degrees. So we have to just sort of think, what did we agree? Are we still sticking to that? Or are we saying that it's 2060 actually, or 2070, or is it actually 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees? So we should not just kid ourselves that we can do this in very many different ways, because either we stick to what was agreed or then we don't, and then we can have the very different pathways. So this is this science-based approach. And if governments want to do something different than they agreed, well, that is the government's right. But then at least we should not say that we are getting there in a very different way, because as I used it at some stage as saying that, well, I want to lose 10 kilos by this summer. Well, I will do it by eating half a pizza, and I will do it by eating only half a chocolate cake per day instead of whole pizza and whole chocolate cake. You will all probably tell me that, well, that's not going to work. Either it's not summer 22, or it's not 10 kilos. It's much less, or it's much further away in the future. This is the thing that if governments want to agree something different, then they should say so, and not just to say that we will somehow muddle through. Thanks.
Thank you. Chris, please. Yes.
Yeah, so I was going to pick up on a few things there. You asked an earlier question about, is Europe more focused on the environment and the S and the G part? I think the perception in Southeast Asia is it is perhaps overly focused on the environment part, but that's probably not wrong. And then it comes back to some of the points that Ida was just making then as well. If we want the region to advance, if we want it to achieve some of its Paris goals, then we've got to really focus hard on things like energy transition, which will then in turn naturally help the companies of the region comply more with what they have to do for Europe. And their fears around things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism would start to be allayed at the same time. But unfortunately, we have governments in the region like Indonesia who are racing to build as many coal-fired power stations as they can before their own poles cut-off date for building them, which is 2025. And we need to do a lot more to educate the government that they can do more to help their businesses help comply with what are increasingly international standards, and not just European ones. You see them coming up from Japan and Korea and the US as well. And if they're not careful, the whole of the world will be marching ahead, and they'll end up being left behind, despite the regulators here, as Miranda was saying earlier, actually doing quite a lot in terms of coming up with new ideas and new standards and new approaches. So we need to do a lot more to help them more generally on these issues. But I think as a European business organization, and I think Europe as well also needs to bear in mind that in Southeast Asia, sustainability is not just the environment. That is often quite a long way down the list. And it's putting food on the table and access to education, access to a decent job, which are higher priorities for most people in Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to come back to the questions from the audience. There's a very simple one here. Are private companies ahead of the regulatory curve? Miranda, let me come to you on this one, because we're just hearing from Chris about some governments might be taking a different approach to climate change, for example, but really the people who should be driving this are corporates themselves. They shouldn't be waiting for regulations. They should be moving ahead as fast as they can. But is that the reality?
You do have some companies which are taking a leading view on this, because they consider climate and sustainability to be a key goal for the company. But I do think it is very much regulatory driven and finance, and regulation at the start, and then financing driven, and then companies, a lot of companies being forced to adopt, and particularly you have a difference between the public markets, where they're obviously facing, as we were talking earlier, you've got the ESG reporting for the public companies, and so they're under much more pressure, particularly as new regulations are being introduced on ESG reporting throughout the region. So the public companies are in a lot of pressure to do a lot of more on sustainability more broadly, but also climate in particular. But yes, in the private markets, where it's much more about the taxonomies, and because I don't think it's that there's necessarily governments are wanting to deviate from their 1.5 degree goals, but it's just how each sector achieves that in each country can be very different, and how you prioritize. Like, do you prioritize transportation or energy or the agricultural sector? So there's a lot of debate about sort of how fast these companies need to do it, which ones you target, which ones you put the heavy regulation on, because if you decarbonize the energy sector, as was mentioned earlier, then you decarbonize all the way downstream as well, which would be fantastic. But so maybe you just focus on that, and that's where a lot of these debates are coming in. And so it's not only just about the 1.5 degree target. It's which companies, which sectors, and in sort of which countries. And there's a huge amount of work to be done on what's the sort of optimal way to achieve that, I think.
Thank you. I'd like to turn on.
If I could.
Oh, Rochelle, go ahead. Yes.
Hi. Yeah. I just wanted to come in because I think Miranda was sort of going on a really good thread. We talked a lot, and I think there's been a lot of focus on financial regulation, the definition of around sustainable investing, but where the sort of real economy impacts and the sort of regulations on that space is where a lot of development needs to happen, and it's starting to happen. And I think, for example, I know what the definition of sustainable investing is. An SME was not going to. So how are they going to be able to hope to comply with something where it's very financial? But we're starting to see, I think, especially in some countries in Southeast Asia, the development of regulations around this. And just a couple of weeks ago, I've seen an example come out of Vietnam of regulations around circular economy. So where producers and importers are now required to have policies in place and to action recycling of their products after the use. So a good example is producing laptops. You've got to then find a plan to be able to recycle and reuse those 20% of those laptops, or invest sustainably. And I think that's the sort of real gap, is to sort of bring the real economy in line with what's happening on the financial side.
Thank you. I'm just going to draw attention to our audience to the final poll of today. It's a very short one and a simple one. And the question is this: who will benefit the most from the harmonisation of standards across Southeast Asia and Europe? European companies, Southeast Asian companies, or it's a win-win for both? So just throw that one out there. We'll come back to it in a moment. And as we're getting those results in, maybe if I could just go around the panel and ask for their, I guess, reflections on what we've been hearing today, not just in this panel, but the previous panels, but then looking ahead as well. Is there something that we haven't touched on that would be really important in this whole context of harmonisation of standards, of the tools that we need, of the transition periods? Is there one real positive that we should be taking away? Is there one key challenge that we all should be identifying and working towards solving? So Chris, I'm going to come to you first and see what your thoughts on there, and give everybody else a little bit of time to marshal their thoughts.
That's a hospital pass. Thank you, Andrew. One thing, I think the need for interoperability between standards, and those standards also need to take into account that we have to have a transition period for moving from where we are today to getting to a net carbon position when it comes to environmental issues, and that we also need to make sure that the broader aspects of ESG are also taken into account at the same time. I think the world's heading that way. ASEAN is certainly heading that way. I think ASEAN is being dragged along a large part by financial institutions and by the needs for large MNCs, but they're catching up and they're getting there.
Good, okay. Rochelle, maybe I could come to you next.
So I very much agree with what Chris has said. I think the only thing I would add is, potentially ASEAN doesn't get the credit it deserves. The will is there. The ability to implement is my experience is what is being discussed, and I think looking forward, developing solutions, making it easier to comply, easier to report. I think there was an example of one supplier needing to report, to many anchors. Having the sort of and simplify and sort of make business function a bit better is where I'm hoping regulators or the players in the industry focus on. It's really people are moving all in the direction, but hopefully we'll get consistency in approach across regulators, across multinationals, across sourcing policies. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Rochelle. And Ela, if I could come to you as well on your thoughts on one thing that we should be thinking about going forward from here.
Well, I'm not going to add anything very much new, but I'm going to sort of underline something that I think Chris said earlier, that governments need to play a role, because I have sometimes a little bit the impression that governments are pointing the finger at the private sector. Corporates need to do this and banks need to do that. And governments are somehow, I think that this is something that the governments have to realize, that they have a very important role to play as showing the way on the educational efforts for sure, and working together to try to streamline things internationally. And I don't mean this by governments in any region. Every single government, be it Asia, be it the Americas, be it Europe, all governments have really, I think, trying to sometimes point the finger too much to the private sector side. They also have a lot of work to do. Thanks.
Thank you. And then Miranda, if I could come to you on that final point.
Well, I think one of the interesting, this came up at some of the other panels as well, but in terms of, who pays for this and who takes responsibility, and whether that should be the European companies or whether it should be the Southeast Asian companies in the supply chain. And it's really interesting in terms of, if you do have the additional cost in terms of both implementing some of the measures plus the reporting, and whether actually the European companies can take a greater role. In the past, they've tended to, you've had alliances formed, you've had organizations formed in terms of the supply chain, particularly focused on things, the retail sector, or the textiles sector, where people have implemented, reporting guidelines. Or it's been in some individual company initiatives where you've had, some of the big, clothing companies saying, okay, we're just going to, release all our supply chain. So you do have the companies, there has been movement both in terms of setting up organizations or, reporting on their own transparent, their own supply chains, which has been very positive. But whether there's, more that needs to be done, particularly now you're bringing in, the whole climate piece, which is, everyone forgets it's so huge now, but it's only really in the last 3 or 4 years where it's got such a attention. So whether there's a role for sort of the European companies and some of the, rather than supply chain, to actually fill some of this gap, I think that's a really interesting role for the private sector. As well as, and that would sort of be promoting best practice, but also helping to, potentially finance that and support that in the region as well. Might be, that could be something that's we haven't really seen before, and is something, because climate's so new, then it's not really, which is, a problem in itself. But that's something where the companies could actually get involved.
And because it's such a pressing issue, it's really sharpening that focus and attention, and we're moving forward, which is what we need to see from everybody.
Yes, yes.
Okay. We are just about out of time. I'm going to come back to our poll question, which I think was a bit of a trick question, but anyway, it was, who will benefit the most from the harmonisation of standards across Southeast Asia and Europe. European companies. 18% of you said it was European countries. 6% said Southeast Asian companies, but everybody else, the 76% who got it right, was it's a win-win for both. I think what we've learned from this panel that there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of good work that's been done already in terms of creating standards and taxonomy. We need to be developing the tools. We need to be helping and supporting all actors within this, and particularly those small and medium-sized enterprises as they look to upgrade their operations, as they look to become more safe and sustainable in their businesses. So I wish everybody on the panel every success in their roles in promoting that push towards greater sustainability within Europe, within Southeast Asia, and indeed between the two regions as well. So thank you very much for that. And thank you, Miranda Carr, Chris Humphrey, Rosh Marabir, and Ela Creevy. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And just a few closing remarks for everybody else. Thank you for being with us all afternoon. Thank you for bearing with us where we had a couple of technical issues around sound and so on. But I think for me, anyway, this has been a very useful, engaging and informative session, or all of the sessions this afternoon, to take us a little bit closer to understanding some of the issues, where the challenges are, where there's been some good progress, and where there's still work to be done. So thank you all for attending Beyond Supply Chains to look at visibility and sustainability. We'd like to give special thanks to all of our speakers across the three panels today, as well as to Standard Chartered for supporting us. We are dependent on your feedback to help us create meaningful discussions in the future, so please do fill in that post survey that's embedded under the media player, and please click submit with your feedback button. Your feedback is highly appreciated and help us improve our future events. And with that, thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Andy Staples. I'm with Economist Impact, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much.